Jane Whitefield sold her first night for $18,000. She would replay that number for months afterward, not because she regretted it, but because it was the exact price of dignity. $18,000 for 2 marble headstones, a double burial plot at Forest Glen Memorial Gardens, and the right to finally stop feeling like her parents' bodies were an inconvenience the city had agreed to store. Jonah Jameson didn't know her name when he made the offer. He was 34, heir to Jameson Energy Holdings, and 3 drinks past the point where his father's company still made sense to him. That night, at a shareholders' dinner at the Ivory Room, the board had quietly begun discussing whether Jonah was fit to inherit full control after his father's stroke. He'd sat through 2 hours of men 20 years his senior debating his competence like he wasn't in the room, then excused himself to the bar and didn't stop drinking until Jane came to clear his glass. She was the one steady thing in a night that had otherwise come apart at the seams. He noticed her hands first, how careful she was setting down his replacement drink, how she didn't flinch when he said something cutting about the woman who'd just left the bar alone. Jane had learned in 8 months of waiting tables at the Ivory Room exactly how to be invisible and indispensable at once. Jonah, drunk enough to lose his filter and sober enough to still have taste, found that unbearably attractive. He asked her to sit with him. She told him she was working. He said he'd pay for her time, the way rich men said things when money had stopped meaning anything to them personally, but still meant everything to the people serving them. Jane almost walked away. She had walked away from worse propositions before, from men who thought a good tip bought more than good service.
But Jonah named a number that stopped her. Not because he tried to buy her with it. He wasn't calculating, not really. He was drunk and lonely and grieving a father who was still alive, but no longer entirely present. But because the number happened to be almost exactly what Jane needed. Her mother had died 11 months ago from a heart that had simply stopped trying, 3 months after her father's had stopped the same way, and both of them were still in the ground at Houston's public cemetery on the east side, unmarked, in a section the city mowed twice a year if anyone complained enough. Jane visited every Sunday and stood over 2 mounds of dirt that had long since flattened into the grass, indistinguishable from the earth around them. She said yes before she let herself think about it twice. The details of that night blurred quickly, even for Jane, who wanted very much to remember them clearly so she could hate herself properly for it later. Jonah's penthouse took up the top 2 floors of the Jameson Tower downtown, all glass and steel and views of a city that looked from that height like a motherboard lit up at dusk. He was gentler than she expected a drunk man to be, more apologetic, kept asking if she was sure, if she wanted to stop, if she was only doing this for the money, as though some part of him, even loosened by whiskey, understood the transaction wasn't equal and wanted her to have an exit. She didn't take it. She'd made her decision in the back of an Uber on the way there, turning the number over in her head like a rosary, converting it silently into 2 headstones, a burial plot with grass instead of gravel, a service with an actual pastor instead of the county's contracted one. By the time they reached his floor, she had already spent the money in her mind a dozen times. What happened between them that night was quiet and unhurried in a way she hadn't expected from a man that drunk. He fell asleep with his hand still resting against her spine, and Jane lay awake beside him until nearly 4 in the morning, staring at the ceiling and doing math. Burial costs, headstone engraving fees, the small additional expense of a wrought iron bench she'd seen once at another family's plot and had wanted for her mother, who'd always said she wanted somewhere people could sit and talk to her.
She left before 6. Jonah was still asleep, his face slack and unguarded in a way it probably never was during business hours. And for a moment, Jane almost felt sorry for him. This man who had everything except, apparently, anyone who stayed once the sun came up. She let herself out quietly, took an Uber back to her aunt's apartment off Alameda Road, and by the time she checked her banking app on the ride home, the money was already there. $18,000, wired at 5:47 a.m. No note, no name attached beyond a company holding account she didn't recognize. She never expected to hear from him again. Men like Jonah Jameson didn't remember waitresses, especially not ones they'd met while 3 drinks passed sober. She told herself this on the drive home, and she told herself this again 3 weeks later when she stood in Forest Glen Memorial Gardens, watching 2 granite headstones lowered into place above her parents' newly reburied remains, the transfer paperwork having taken far longer than the actual money had. Her Aunt Melda stood beside her that day, gripping Jane's hand so hard it left marks, both of them crying for reasons that had very little to do with grief and everything to do with relief. "They're home now," Melda said, and Jane nodded because she couldn't speak past the lump lodged in her throat. She thought that was the end of it, a closed transaction, a night she'd sealed away in the part of her mind reserved for things she'd done out of necessity rather than desire, the way she'd once pawned her mother's wedding ring to cover a light bill and never once regretted it, even though she missed the ring every day. She did not think about Jonah Jameson again until 6 weeks later, standing in her bathroom at 4 in the morning, staring at a test strip that had turned an undeniable, unmistakable pink. Jane sat on the edge of the bathtub for a long time that morning, the test balanced on her knee, running through a calculation far more complicated than headstones and burial plots. She thought about the shoebox under her bed, empty now except for the folded newspaper clipping of her parents' obituary. She thought about Melda, who worked doubles at the laundromat and had never once asked Jane to pay rent, who deserved better than the chaos Jane was about to bring into the small apartment they shared. She thought, briefly and uselessly, about the man whose face she barely remembered clearly, a blur of dark hair and tired eyes, and a voice that had asked, more than once, if she was sure. She did not think, not yet, about how she would ever tell him. Jane went to work that evening anyway, because the rent didn't pause for complicated mornings, and neither did the Ivory Room's dinner rush. She smiled at tables, refilled water glasses, took an order from a party of 6 who sent back their appetizers twice, and did not for a single moment during her shift imagine that within a week Jonah Jameson would see her again, not across a bar this time, but across a hospital parking lot, stepping out of her gynecologist's office with a folder of paperwork in her hands, while he stood 12 feet away holding open the passenger door of a town car for his grandmother. Neither of them said a word in that parking lot. Jonah simply stopped moving, his hand still on the car door, staring at Jane the way a man stares at a math problem that had suddenly, violently solved itself in front of him. His grandmother, Eleanor Jameson, understood the arithmetic a full 3 seconds before her. Eleanor Jameson had buried 2 husbands and raised 1 difficult son, and in 81 years she had learned to read a room faster than most people could read a sentence. So when she saw the waitress from her grandson's favorite restaurant walking out of a gynecologist's office with a folder pressed to her chest, and saw Jonah freeze like a man who'd just been shot, she didn't need anyone to explain the math to her. She'd done enough arithmetic in her lifetime to recognize the shape of it instantly. "Get in the car, Jonah," she said quietly. And when he didn't move, she said it again, sharper this time. Jane didn't wait to see what happened next. She turned and walked quickly toward her own car, a 14-year-old Honda parked at the far end of the lot, her hand shaking so badly she fumbled the key twice before it caught. In the rearview mirror, she watched Jonah standing frozen beside the town car, her grandmother's hand gripping his wrist through the open door, and she drove away before either of them could stop her. She didn't hear from him that day or the next. For 4 days, Jane allowed herself to believe that the parking lot had been a coincidence he'd already forgotten, that men like Jonah Jameson didn't chase down waitresses over a look exchanged across a stretch of asphalt. She went to work, endured a lecture from her manager about a dropped tray, and came home each night with Imelda's questions about why she seemed distracted, which Jane deflected with the same tired excuse: long shifts, tired feet, nothing more. On the 5th day, A black town car was parked outside the apartment on Alameda Road when Jane got home from her shift. Jonah stood beside it, out of his suit for once, dressed in a simple charcoal Henley and dark jeans, looking less like a man who ran an energy empire and more like someone who hadn't slept in days. He'd found her address through the restaurant's employee records, a call to the general manager, a threat wrapped in enough charm to seem like a favor, and the address had simply appeared. He knew, standing there, that it was an over.
"I need to talk to you," he said when she approached, and Jane, exhausted and cornered and unwilling to have this conversation on the sidewalk in front of her aunt's building, told him to follow her to the small park 2 blocks over instead. They sat on opposite ends of a bench that had seen better decades, and Jane told him everything in the flattest voice she could manage. The timeline, the test, the appointment, the due date her doctor had estimated. She did not soften it for him, did not apologize, did not ask him for anything. She had learned in the 4 days since the parking lot that the safest way to survive this conversation was to give him nothing to hold on to, no vulnerability to exploit, no opening to make her feel smaller than she already did. Jonah listened without interrupting, which surprised her. When she finished, he sat quietly for a long moment, staring at his hands, and then he said the one thing Jane hadn't prepared herself to hear. "What do you need from me? Not what you think I'll offer, what you actually need." She hadn't expected kindness. She had expected a lawyer, a settlement offer, an NDA slid across a table by someone in a suit who wasn't Jonah himself. Instead, she got a man who looked, for the first time since she'd met him, entirely sober and entirely present, asking her a question no one had asked her in longer than she could remember. Jane told him she needed nothing from him. She had a job, she had Imelda, she had a plan, however threadbare it was, and she didn't intend to build her life around a man who wouldn't remember her name in 6 months if the child hadn't existed. Jonah didn't argue with her that day. He simply asked if he could see her again. Not for anything, he clarified, just to talk, just to understand what he was about to become responsible for. She said no. He came back anyway, 3 days later, this time with prenatal vitamins he'd clearly researched at 2 in the morning, and a folder of his own. Information on the best obstetricians in Houston, offers to cover every medical expense regardless of what Jane decided about the rest of it. He didn't push for anything beyond that. He simply left the folder with Imelda when Jane refused to come to the door and drove away without another word. Melda, who had raised Jane through 2 funerals and a childhood of small griefs, took one look at the folder and the car pulling away and said, "That man is scared, baby. Scared men either run or they show up. This one's showing up." Jane didn't want to hear it. She'd built her entire adult life around not needing anyone, around the particular independence that came from losing both parents before 23 and learning that people, even good ones, eventually left or died or both. She didn't have room in that architecture for a billionaire who showed up at inconvenient hours with vitamins and guilt. But Jonah kept showing up, not aggressively, not in the way she'd feared from someone with his resources and his name. No lawyers threatening custody, no public statements, no attempt to control her from a distance the way she'd read about in tabloid stories about men like him. He simply appeared, consistently in small ways. A car to take her to her prenatal appointments when her Honda finally gave out for good. A standing account with the pharmacy near her apartment so she never had to pay a copay again. Dinner invitations she mostly declined, except for the ones where he showed up at the diner near her apartment instead of asking her to some downtown restaurant where she'd feel like she was on display. It was during the 6th week of this quiet, persistent presence that Eleanor Jameson requested a meeting of her own. She summoned Jane, there was no other word for it despite the polite phrasing of the invitation, to her home in River Oaks, a house with more square footage than the entire apartment building Jane lived in. Jane went alone, without Jonah, at Eleanor's specific request, and found the old woman waiting for her on a sunlit patio with tea already.
"I'm not going to insult you by asking you if you did this for the money," Eleanor said, before Jane had even fully sat down. "I already know you did.
What I want to know is whether you're the kind of woman who stops there or the kind who builds something real once the money's no longer the point." Jane, stunned by the bluntness, took a long moment before answering. She told Eleanor the truth, that she hadn't set out to fall into anything with Jonah, hadn't planned for any of this, and didn't know yet what she was building, only that she refused to be ashamed of how it started. Eleanor studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as though Jane had passed some test she hadn't known she was taking. "My grandson has been surrounded by people who want something from him his entire life," she said. "You're the first person in years who didn't ask him for anything. That matters more than you understand right now." She didn't say much more than that, but she didn't need to. By the time Jane left River Oaks that afternoon, something in the architecture of her resistance had shifted just slightly, just enough to let a little more light in. Jonah found out about the meeting from his grandmother herself 3 days later, over a dinner where Eleanor informed him, without asking his permission, that she approved. Jonah, who had spent 6 weeks being careful not to push Jane toward anything she wasn't ready for, felt something loosen in his chest for the first time since the night he'd watched her walk away in a hospital parking lot. He didn't call her that night. Instead, he showed up at her apartment the next morning, before her shift, with 2 coffees and no folder, no vitamins, no agenda beyond wanting to see her face. "I'm not here about the baby," he told her when she opened the door with visible suspicion. "I just wanted to see you. Is that allowed?" Jane, standing in the doorway in her waitress uniform with her hair still damp from the shower, found she didn't have an answer ready. For the first time since the night at the Ivory Room, she let him in anyway. Jonah stepped into Jane's apartment that first morning, coffee cups still warm in his hands, and found himself unexpectedly nervous in a way boardrooms had never made him. The space was small, a living room that doubled as a dining area, a kitchen barely large enough for 2 people to stand in at once, but it was warm in a way his own penthouse never managed to be, cluttered with photographs of Jane as a child, a woman he assumed was her mother, and a man with Jane's same steady eyes who had to be her father. Melda emerged from the back bedroom, already dressed for her shift at the laundromat, took one look at Jonah standing awkwardly in her living room holding 2 coffees, and simply said, "Well, look who finally got invited past the doorstep," before grabbing her keys and leaving for work without further comment, though the smile she gave Jane on her way out said everything her words hadn't. They sat at the small kitchen table, and for the first time since the night at the Ivory Room, Jonah asked Jane questions that had nothing to do with the pregnancy, where she'd grown up, what she'd wanted to be before circumstances narrowed her choices down to whatever paid the bills fastest. Jane found herself answering honestly, surprised at how easy it was once she stopped bracing for an agenda that never came. She told him about wanting to study nursing before her parents' deaths drained every dollar she'd saved for school. She told him about her mother's laugh, which she was starting to lose the exact sound of in her memory, and how that scared her more than almost anything else about grief. Jonah told her things too, about a father who was technically alive, but increasingly absent behind eyes that no longer fully recognized him, about a company that had been the only language his family knew how to love each other in, about the loneliness of being surrounded by people who wanted access to him rather than him specifically. Jane realized somewhere in that conversation that Eleanor had been right. Jonah Jameson had been starving for a very long time, in a way money couldn't touch. He stayed for 2 hours that morning, well past the point where either of them had an excuse to keep talking, and when he finally left, he didn't ask to see her again. He simply said he hoped he could, and left it there, giving her the room to decide with. She texted him that evening. It was a small thing, barely more than a comment about a doctor's appointment coming up, but it was Jane reaching first, and Jonah recognized the significance of it even in something so minor. He showed up to that appointment 3 days later, sitting in the waiting room like any anxious partner might, and when the ultrasound technician asked if he wanted to see the screen, he said yes before Jane had even turned to ask him. The image on the screen was still too early to reveal much beyond a small flickering shape, but Jonah stared at it like it was the only thing in the world worth looking at. Jane watched him watch the screen and felt something shift in her chest, some wall she'd built with careful precision over years of losing people, cracking just slightly at the edges. They fell into a rhythm over the following weeks that neither of them named out loud. Jonah came by most evenings, sometimes with dinner, sometimes just to sit while Jane did homework for the online nursing prerequisite courses she'd finally allowed herself to enroll in, using money Jonah insisted on covering despite her repeated refusals. He learned her schedule, learned which of Melda's stories to laugh at and which to take seriously, learned that Jane preferred silence over small talk on her hardest days, and knew, without being told, when those days were. Jane, in turn, learned things about Jonah the tabloids and business articles never captured, that he called his grandmother every single day, even when his schedule was brutal, that he started therapy quietly 6 months before meeting Jane, after a panic attack in a board meeting he'd never told anyone about except Eleanor, that underneath the wealth and the name and the company he was inheriting, whether he wanted it or not, he was a man trying, clumsily and sincerely, to become someone worth the trust his grandmother had placed in a stranger's judgment of him. It was on a Tuesday evening, 6 weeks into this quiet, unnamed rhythm, that Jonah kissed her. The first time. They were standing in her kitchen, Jane laughing at something Melda had said before leaving for a night shift, Jonah watching her laugh with an expression she hadn't fully registered until he closed the distance between them and kissed her like he'd been wanting to for longer than either of them.
Jane didn't pull away. She'd spent weeks bracing herself against exactly this outcome, telling herself it would complicate everything, that she couldn't afford to fall for a man whose world operated by rules she didn't understand, and whose family, however kind Eleanor had been, might not tolerate a Houston waitress as a permanent fixture in Jonah's life. But standing in her kitchen with his hand gentle against her jaw, none of those warnings held the weight they once had. "I know this started wrong," Jonah said quietly, when they finally pulled apart. "I know I have no right to ask for anything more than what I'm already giving, but I'm asking anyway. Let me actually try, not because of the baby, because of you." Jane, who had spent years building a life that required nothing from anyone, found herself, for the first time, willing to need something. "Okay," she said, "let's try." Neither of them noticed, in that quiet kitchen moment, the black sedan parked across the street that had been there for 3 days running, or the man inside it with a camera lens and a retainer paid by someone neither of them.
His name was Marcus Blevins, and he'd been a private investigator for 11 years before Diane Whitcomb hired him for what she'd framed as a simple background check on her nephew's newest romantic interest. Diane was Eleanor's younger sister-in-law by marriage, a woman who had never quite forgiven the Jameson family for the way the company's board seats had been distributed a generation earlier, and who saw in Jane's sudden appearance in Jonah's life an opportunity she'd been waiting years to exploit. Marcus's photographs of Jane going back 3 weeks, grocery store runs, the ultrasound appointment through a long lens from across the parking lot, the kitchen kiss captured through a gap in the blinds Jane hadn't realized existed. None of it was illegal, strictly speaking, all of it taken from public sidewalks and streets. But all of it was deeply, invasively personal, and none of it had been taken with anything resembling good intentions. Diane's plan was simple and old-fashioned in its cruelty. Leak the pregnancy to a tabloid before Jonah or Jane could control the narrative themselves. Frame Jane as a gold-digging waitress who'd trapped Houston's most eligible bachelor with a calculated pregnancy, and use the resulting scandal to argue, in the quiet rooms where Jameson Energy's board actually made decisions, that Jonah's judgment couldn't be trusted with the company's future if he couldn't even manage his personal life without inviting tabloid chaos. The story broke on a Thursday morning,
6 weeks after the kitchen kiss, while Jane was on her way to a prenatal appointment she no longer needed a car service to attend because Jonah had, over her repeated objections, simply bought her a reliable used car outright the week before. She found out about the article the way most people found out about disasters now, a phone buzzing insistently with text from coworkers, a headline glaring up from her lock screen before she...
Houston's billionaire bachelor trapped. Waitress Jane Whitfield's calculated pregnancy threatens Jameson Energy succession. The article was vicious in the specific way only tabloid journalism could manage, weaving true facts into a narrative engineered to wound. It mentioned the $18,000, framing it not as a desperate woman's solution to burying her parents, but as evidence of premeditation, as though Jane had somehow orchestrated Jonah's drunkenness and her own waitressing job as an elaborate trap laid months in advance. It included a quote from an unnamed source close to the family, Diane, though she was careful enough not to attach her name, suggesting Jane had a history of targeting wealthy clientele at the Ivory Room, a claim so baseless Jane couldn't even locate the lie's origin point. Jane sat in her car outside the medical building for 20 minutes before she could make herself go inside, her hands shaking around a phone that wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications from an Instagram account she rarely used, strangers she'd never met leaving comments calling her things she didn't have the strength to fully read. Jonah found out about the article roughly the same time she did, sitting in a Jameson Energy board meeting that had ironically been scheduled to discuss quarterly earnings and nothing else. He watched 3 board members' phones light up in near simultaneous succession, watched their expressions shift from boredom to barely concealed satisfaction, and understood immediately that this had been planned by someone inside his own family before he'd even read the headline himself. He left the meeting without excusing himself properly, a breach of protocol that would generate its own gossip by the afternoon, and called Jane from the elevator, his voice tight with a fury she'd never heard from him before, though none of it was directed at her. "I'm coming to you. Don't read the comments, don't answer any calls from numbers you don't recognize. I'm handling this." What handling this meant in practice was a level of controlled ruthlessness Jane hadn't previously witnessed in him. By that evening, Jonah had traced the leak back to Diane through a combination of his own legal team and a private investigator of his own, hired specifically to identify Marcus Blevins and the paper trail connecting her to her personal accounts. He called an emergency meeting of the family trust that controlled a significant portion of Jameson Energy's voting shares, a meeting Eleanor attended in person, despite Jonah's insistence she didn't need to trouble her. Eleanor, it turned out, had been waiting for an excuse like this for years. Diane's resentment over the board seats was old news within the family, tolerated rather than confronted because confrontation was messier than quiet tension. But leaking a pregnant woman's private medical information to a tabloid, endangering not just Jonah's reputation, but the well-being of an unborn great-grandchild, was not something Eleanor was willing to tolerate quietly. She stripped Diane's voting rights within the trust that same week, a move that made no public headlines but sent unmistakable ripples through Houston's old money circles, where everyone understood exactly what it meant when Eleanor Jameson moved that decisively against family. Jonah, meanwhile, issued no public statement defending himself or explaining the circumstances of Jane's pregnancy, a decision his PR team argued against strenuously. Instead, 3 days after the article broke, he did something none of them had anticipated. He walked into the Ivory Room during the dinner rush, found Jane midway through her shift because she'd insisted on working through the scandal rather than hiding from it, a decision Melda had supported despite her own fury at the article, and, in front of every diner and staff member present, got down on one knee. He didn't propose marriage. That would come later, and both of them agreed privately it needed to come later, once the dust settled and Jane could say yes for reasons that had nothing to do with damage control. Instead, kneeling on the restaurant floor in his tailored suit, phones already rising around the room to capture the moment, Jonah simply said, loud enough for the room and, by nightfall, the internet to hear clearly,
I want the whole world to know I'm proud to be having a child with this woman. Anyone who has a problem with that can direct it to me." The video went viral within hours, reframing the entire narrative the tabloid had constructed. Public sentiment, fickle and quick to pivot, swung hard in Jane's favor, aided considerably by a follow-up statement from Eleanor Jameson herself, a rare public comment from a woman who'd spent decades avoiding press entirely, confirming her full support for Jane and condemning, without naming Diane directly, the cowardly and cruel actions of someone with.
By the following week, the original tabloid had issued a retraction on the more baseless claims. Diane had quietly relocated to a property the family owned in Colorado to wait out the fallout. And Jane found herself, for the first time in the entire ordeal, able to walk through a grocery store without a stranger's whispered recognition following her down the aisle. But the scandal left its mark in quieter ways too. Jane, who had spent her entire adult life avoiding dependence on anyone, found herself now permanently visible in a way she couldn't undo. Recognized in public, discussed by strangers, folded irreversibly into a family and a world she hadn't fully agreed to join, even as she'd chosen in her own kitchen to try. That night, after the video had racked up millions of views and Melda had finally stopped crying happy, furious tears over her niece's public defense, Jonah sat with Jane on her small couch, her feet in his lap, and asked the question that had been sitting underneath everything since the article broke. "Are you still in this?" he asked quietly. "Knowing what it costs now. Knowing it's not just me anymore." Jane looked at him for a long moment, thinking of her parents' granite headstones, of Melda's exhausted joy, of the small flickering shape she'd seen on an ultrasound screen weeks earlier. "I was never just in it for you," she said. "I'm in it for whatever we're building." The pregnancy reached its second trimester in the quiet after the storm, and with the tabloid scandal fading into old news cycles, Jane and Jonah settled into something that almost resembled normal life, if normal life included security details discreetly parked outside apartment buildings and a rotating cast of Jameson energy lawyers who occasionally needed Jane's signature on documents she barely understood. Melda had taken an early retirement package Jonah insisted on arranging, a gesture Jane had fought against for 2 full weeks before finally relenting when she watched her aunt cry, actual tears, at the idea of never standing behind a laundromat counter again. Melda moved into a modest but comfortable house Jonah purchased for her 15 minutes from Jane's own new apartment, an upgrade from Alameda Road that Jane had also resisted before pregnancy fatigue and common sense won out over pride. But money, Jane was learning quickly, solved certain problems while creating entirely new ones. Jonah's world came with its own unspoken rules, rules Jane hadn't grown up learning and now had to absorb in real time, usually by making a mistake first. She learned the hard way that Jameson family charity galas required specific etiquette around donation amounts and public acknowledgments. She learned that Jonah's assistant, a sharp, efficient woman named Priya, had strong opinions about which designers Jane should wear to public events. Opinions Jane mostly ignored in favor of her own taste, a small rebellion that quietly delighted Eleanor when she found out about it. She also learned that not everyone in Jonah's orbit had softened toward her the way Eleanor had. Jonah's business partner and closest friend since college, a man named Terrence Vaughn, remained coolly polite toward Jane in a way that never crossed into rudeness but never warmed into genuine welcome either. Jane noticed it in small ways, the way Terrence's eyes flicked toward her hands when she reached for anything at a dinner table, as though calculating what she might be angling to take, the way his questions about her background carried an edge dressed up as. Jonah noticed it too, eventually, at a dinner 3 months into the pregnancy, where Terrence made an offhand comment about some people finding creative ways to secure their future, a comment aimed clearly enough at Jane that the table went quiet for a beat too long. Jonah didn't raise his voice. He simply set down his fork,
looked at Terrence with an expression Jane hadn't seen from him before, and told his oldest friend evenly that the next comment like that would be the last conversation they ever had. Terrence apologized stiffly, and the dinner continued, but Jane understood in that moment the particular loneliness of being loved fiercely by someone whose entire world hadn't yet caught up to the choice he'd made. The isolation crept in slowly after that. Jane found herself withdrawing from social gatherings she used to attend for Jonah's sake, tired of being the subject of quiet calculation dressed up as small talk. She threw herself instead into her nursing prerequisites, finishing her first full semester with a transcript she was fiercely proud of, and into preparing the nursery in the new apartment, a room she and Melda painted together on a weekend Jonah spent handling a merger crisis 3 states away. It was during one of Jonah's increasingly frequent business trips that Jane had her first real scare. She woke at 2 in the morning with sharp cramping that sent her into a controlled panic, calling Melda first, and then, hands shaking, calling Jonah's cell, which went straight to voicemail because he was mid-flight somewhere over Colorado. Melda drove her to the hospital while Jane tried 3 more times to reach him, each unanswered call amplifying a fear she hadn't let herself fully feel until that moment. The fear of building a life around a man whose responsibilities would sometimes, unavoidably, keep him somewhere else. The isolation turned out to be nothing dangerous, a false alarm doctors attributed to stress and dehydration. But Jonah landed to 11 missed calls and a voicemail from Melda that made his blood run cold before he'd even collected his luggage. He arrived at the hospital still in his travel clothes, having chartered a return flight the second his plane touched ground, and found Jane sitting up in a hospital bed, exhausted but stable, Melda dozing in the chair beside her.
He didn't say anything for a long moment, just stood in the doorway processing the particular horror of nearly losing something he hadn't fully understood he needed until the possibility of losing it became real. Then he crossed the room, sat on the edge of her bed, and apologized in a way that had nothing performative about it. No grand gesture, no cameras, just a man admitting, quietly, that he let his phone die on a business trip while the person carrying his child needed him, and that it would never happen again. "I need you to understand something," Jane told him, once the adrenaline had faded enough to let her speak clearly. "I'm not scared of you not being rich enough or powerful enough or connected enough to handle anything that comes up. I'm scared of being someone you love in theory, while your real life happens somewhere else, with people who understand your world better than I ever will." Jonah took that in fully, the way he'd learned to take in Jane's honesty over the past several months, without deflecting it or minimizing it into something easier to hear. He told her, then, about restructuring his travel schedule, about delegating more of the trips that didn't require his direct presence, about the therapy he'd continued quietly through the entire pregnancy, working through his own instinct to solve every problem by throwing resources at it instead of showing up in the ways that actually mattered. It was a turning point neither of them announced to anyone else, not even Melda or Eleanor, but Jane noticed the shift in the weeks that followed. Jonah delegated the Colorado trip's remaining negotiations to Terrence, a decision that repaired some of the tension between the two men simply by forcing Terrence to prove his competence outside Jonah's shadow. He started attending Jane's prenatal appointments even when his schedule technically allowed him to send a car instead, sitting through routine checkups that offered no dramatic ultrasound reveals, just the quiet reassurance of showing up. Eleanor, watching all of this unfold with the patient satisfaction of a woman who'd seen enough Jameson men make the opposite mistake, took Jane aside during the quiet Sunday visit and told her something Jane would carry with her for the rest of the pregnancy. "My husband built an empire and lost a marriage doing it," Eleanor said, watching Jonah through the kitchen window as he attempted, with visible concentration, to assemble a crib according to instructions he kept squinting at upside down. "My husband spent 30 years telling myself the empire was worth it. It wasn't. What you're teaching my grandson right now, that showing up matters more than providing, that's the inheritance that actually counts."
By the 7th month, the nursery was finished, painted a soft sage green Jane had chosen herself over Priya's suggested neutral palette, decorated with a mobile Melda had found at an estate sale, and refinished by hand. Jonah had reduced his travel by nearly 60%, delegating what he could and simply declining what he couldn't, a shift that cost the company some efficiency but bought him something Jane suspected he valued more now than he once had. They hadn't discussed marriage explicitly since the restaurant proposal months earlier, both of them silently agreeing to let that conversation happen on its own timeline, away from scandal or obligation. But on a quiet evening in the 8th month, with Jane's feet propped in his lap on the same couch where he'd once asked if she was still in this, Jonah reached into a drawer in the side table and pulled out a small box he'd apparently been carrying around for weeks, waiting for a moment that didn't need to be dramatic, to be real. "I'm not doing this in a restaurant this time," he said, opening the box to reveal a ring far simpler than Jane had expected from a man of his means. Elegant, understated, nothing that demanded attention. "I'm doing it here, where it actually happened, where you let me in the first time." Jane, 8 months pregnant and entirely unprepared despite months of half expecting this moment, found she didn't need time to think about her answer at all. Jane said yes, with tears streaking down her face, and Jonah, still kneeling awkwardly beside the couch, one hand braced against the cushion for balance, since getting back up gracefully with a full-term pregnant fiancée reaching for him wasn't exactly built into his plan. The ring fit perfectly, a detail Jane would later learn had taken Priya 3 discreet visits to Melda's house to get right, measuring Jane's old jewelry while she slept over during a weekend visit months earlier. They didn't announce the engagement publicly right away. Both of them had learned enough from the tabloid scandal to understand the value of protecting something before the world got its hands on it. So, for the first 2 weeks, the engagement belonged only to the people who mattered. Melda, who cried for a solid 10 minutes before demanding to see the ring properly, and Eleanor, who received the news with a satisfaction so complete it bordered on smug, though she'd earned the right to that smugness after everything she'd quietly orchestrated to get them there. The public announcement came on Jane's terms, not Jonah's publicity team's. No restaurant proposal replay, no stage photo shoot. Just a simple statement Jane wrote herself, and Jonah posted alongside a photo neither of them had planned to be particularly flattering, just real. Jane laughing at something off camera, 8 months pregnant, Jonah's hand resting on her belly, both of them caught mid-moment rather than posed. The caption read simply, "Grateful doesn't cover it. More soon." The internet, having already rehabilitated its opinion of Jane after the restaurant video, embraced the announcement with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for redemption narratives people wanted to believe in. Wedding planning began in earnest despite Jane's due date looming only weeks away, both of them agreeing quickly that the ceremony itself would wait until after the baby arrived. Small and private, nothing like the 600-guest spectacle Jonah's mother, largely absent from the narrative until now, having remarried and relocated to Singapore years earlier, tried unsuccessfully to insert herself into. Jane went into labor on a Tuesday morning, 3 days past her due date, with a suddenness that caught Melda off guard despite weeks of preparation. Jonah, true to the promise he'd made in the hospital months earlier, was 15 minutes away at a meeting he cut short mid-sentence the moment Jane's contractions started coming close enough to matter, arriving at the hospital before Jane had even finished being checked into a delivery room. Labor stretched through 11 difficult hours during which Jonah proved himself entirely unprepared for the particular helplessness of watching someone he loved in pain he couldn't fix with money or connections or anything except staying exactly where he was, holding her hand through contractions, apologizing uselessly when there was nothing to apologize for, learning in real time what Eleanor had meant about showing up mattering more than providing. Their daughter was born at 9:47 that evening, 7 pounds 2 ounces, with a full head of dark curly hair and lungs strong enough to announce her arrival to the entire maternity ward. They named her Amara Eleanor Jameson. Amara for Brace, a name Jane had loved since childhood, and Eleanor for the woman who'd looked at a scared pregnant stranger on a sunlit patio and decided to bet on her anyway. Eleanor, when she finally held her first great-grandchild 2 hours later, wept in a way none of the family had seen from her in decades, the composed matriarch dissolving briefly into something rawer and more grateful than her public persona ever allowed. The wedding happened 6 weeks later, small and intimate as promised, held at Eleanor's River Oaks estate rather than any of the ballrooms Jonah's world usually favored. Jane wore a simple ivory dress, nothing designer flashy, chosen specifically because it made her feel like herself rather than a performance of what a Jameson bride should look like. Melda walked her down a short garden aisle, since Jane had no father left to do it, and Jane had asked for no one else, wanting the moment to honor exactly what it was, rather than paper over her father's act.
Terrence attended, notably humbled since the Colorado negotiations Jonah had handed him months earlier, standing now as Jonah's best man in a gesture of repaired friendship neither man discussed aloud, but both understood as significant. He gave a toast at the small reception that surprised everyone, including himself, by being genuinely warm rather than politely obligatory, admitting in front of the gathered guests that he'd misjudged Jane badly and was grateful to have been proven wrong. Jane's vows were simple. She talked about a shoebox under a bed, about 2 granite headstones, about a man who'd asked what she needed rather than what he assumed she wanted, and about learning, slowly and against every instinct she'd built to protect herself, that letting someone in wasn't the same as losing herself to them. Jonah's vows were less composed, breaking twice with emotion he didn't try to hide from the small gathered crowd. He talked about a night he barely remembered clearly, about a woman who'd asked him nothing and given him everything anyway, about a daughter who taught him more about presence in 6 weeks than 35 years of his family's business empire ever had. Eleanor, watching from the front row with Amara asleep against her chest, understood she was witnessing the thing she'd hoped for since that first sunlit conversation on her patio. Not a transaction completed, not a scandal contained, but something genuinely built, slowly and honestly from a night neither of them had planned into a family neither of them had expected.